Hello and welcome to my review of a movie called Japan's Longest Day from 1967. A movie that deals with the surrender of Japan in the Second World War and a 24-hour period preceding the official announcement to the Japanese people. The video is divided into small chapters, where I will talk about specific points. The timecodes of chapters are in the description, so feel free to skip to a specific topic, though I would recommend watching the video as a whole, since I might be referring to some points I have mentioned earlier and to have a better context. The time of the movie's release is important and tells us the initial motives for its creation. The 60s were for Japan times of a good fortune. The economy was booming and the standard of living was quickly improving. That also meant increase of televisions in households, which led to a decrease in popularity of cinemas. Harold Solomon says following: between 1958 and 1964, the number of cinema visits in Japan dropped from more than 1.1 billion per year to about 430 million, whereas once there had been 7,000 cinemas in Japan, only 4,600 were left by the year 1965. Therefore, production companies were forced to analyze their strengths and to devise new strategies. Toho Studios needed to make a fresh change, so they look back at their past when during the Second World War they made a lot of successful war movies. And so after the end of the Allied occupation in 1952, they started making war movies again. Another reason for making war movies again was the ongoing Vietnam War. Many Japanese started to identify with the Vietnamese and their repressed war memories were coming back, and so they needed to deal with the experiences. War movies offered a help by retelling the history. In 1965, the Pacific War Study Group published a project called Japan's Longest Day. For this book, authors interviewed eyewitnesses of those events. Toho Studio liked this project enough that they made a film version of the story. 1967 was also a year of Toho's 35th anniversary, and Japan's Longest Day was announced to be a celebration of it. Before the production began, Toho made around 2,000 interviews where they found out that around 90% of the interviewed people have heard about the Potsdam Declaration, but less than 10% have heard about the Emperor's rescript of surrender. They used these data to prove this subject to be relevant. From the beginning, the studio portrayed this movie as being historically accurate, thus having an educational value. In July 1967, Toho launched a huge campaign for the movie. They made many posters, scripts, and pamphlets such as these that explained the context of the story and introduced the main characters. The movie was released 12th of August, close to the commemoration of the end of the war on the 15th of August. The movie features the biggest stars of Japanese cinema familiar even to the outside world. Toshiro Mifune as the Minister of War General Anami, Chishu Ryu as the Prime Minister Suzuki, Seiji Miyaguchi as the Foreign Minister Togo. Even the faceless narrator's role was portrayed by Nakadai Tatsuya. The list is just endless. The director of this movie is Kihachi Okamoto. He is mainly famous for movies such as Kill, Samurai Assassin, Red Lion, and so on. He started working as a director assistant at the age of 19 during the Second World War. He was later assigned to work in a factory and make fighter planes because the situation in Japan was getting worse and Toho Studios didn't need as many director assistants. He was drafted into the army in 1945, where he stayed for the last 8 months of the war. After the war, he started working as a director assistant again. Though he had experienced the war and had his reasons for making Japan's Longest Day, he was not the first choice as a director. In a 1967 interview with Chris D, he explains: I had heard that Masaki Kobayashi was supposed to be directing Japan's Longest Day, but that he didn't want to do it and had refused the assignment, and consequently the picture was just kind of hanging in limbo. I said that I thought that was a picture Toho should definitely make. Then Mr. Fujimoto, who was a producer at Toho, said, "Why don't you do it?" so that's how that came about. At the end of his career, almost a third of Okamoto's films were about war. Some of them serious as Japan's Longest Day, other more satirical such as his Desperado movies, which hasn't received very positive reviews at the beginning. In a survey by Kinema Yunpo in 2000, public celebrities ranked him as the 15th favorite Japanese director. One of the biggest difficulties with the movie is to keep track of the location. Overall, the main event is happening in Tokyo, but we learn about 3 other locations outside of Tokyo. We have Atsuki Air Base with Base Commander Kozono in charge, Captain Sasaki of Yokohama Guards and his group of student rebels, and Kodama Air Base with the Air Force Brigade Commander Colonel Yanaka, who sends kamikaze pilots to fight off US fleet 4,000 kilometers of Boso Peninsula. The Potsdam Declaration was not, as mentioned in the movie, the first declaration Japan had received. 2 years earlier, in 1943, the Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek, American President Franklin Roosevelt, and Prime Minister of the United Kingdom Winston Churchill had met at the Cairo Conference in Egypt. Since Japan was not at that time so desperate, they obviously hadn't accepted it. At the end, the Cairo Declaration was a part of the Potsdam Declaration. Right from the beginning of the movie, we can see foreign ministers' reaction to the Potsdam Declaration, fearing what will the army do. That is for a reason, because the following uprising is not the first one. In fact, there had been already 5 military coups during the Second World War before this one. 2 in 1931, 1 in 1932, 1934 and 1936. In all these coups, the government opposing the army was the target, so the fear of the army was quite appropriate. I will leave links to each coup in the description. Even though for many of us now it's almost impossible to understand why the army did everything they could to prevent the surrender, we can look at some reasons for their behavior. This was actually the first war Japan had ever lost. Before and during the First World War, Japan was very successful with their battles. Defeating China and even Russia was something nobody outside Japan really expected. How could such a small country that had been until recently very underdeveloped win against someone as big as China and Russia? Japanese ego rose after many victories before and during the First World War and at the beginning of the Second World War. They truly believed they were a superior race and nobody could defeat them. Their fighting mentality from Bushido and samurai culture basically forbid them to surrender. Honor for them meant more than life itself, and that is why they were even willing to apply the kamikaze concept of suicidal plane attacks. An interesting scene in the movie where Navy Vice Chief of Staff Admiral Onishi, the inventor of the kamikaze attacks, begs the foreign minister to give him 20 more million kamikaze pilots, that after that they would surely win. I couldn't believe that this was really what the Admiral had proposed, but even the book by the Research Society of Pacific War mentioned this occasion. According to the National Second World War Museum in the United States, Japan had around 2 million military casualties and another 1 million of civilian casualties. Compare this to a proposal for another 20 million suicidal fighters, and it gives you an idea what some Japanese were willing to do to prevent the loss. Another interesting character that didn't like the idea of surrender was a base commander, Colonel Kozono. In the movie, we can see the commander fighting off not just the surrender, but also his malaria, thanks to which he was not as able to rebel as he would have liked. But it actually didn't end with the Emperor's radio broadcast. Even after the surrender, Kozono and his men at the airbase started to airdrop pamphlets about the Emperor being deceived by his cabinet and that war still continues. But almost as an act of fate, early after his attempts to continue the war, he had a nervous breakdown and was transported to a Navy hospital. When the Prime Minister Suzuki came to the office, he sensed what was asked of him. He was not particularly skilled in the politics, and his old age could give him some disadvantages. At the beginning, Suzuki refused to take the role as a prime minister, though once he learned the Emperor could trust him with ending the war once and for all, he made no more objections. In the book The Fall of Japan by William Craig, the Lord Keeper of the previous heel, Marquis Koichi Kido, tells Suzuki this: Japan's situation is so critical that I, as Lord Keeper, must implore you to make a firm decision to save the nation. He was the third and the last prime minister during the Pacific War. After the surrender, he called for a mass resignation of the whole cabinet. The Emperor's recording played a major role in the whole incident. Nowadays, it is known under a name dual voice broadcast. What we have not learned from the movie, though, was that the recording that was played was not actually the first one. Because Emperor's voice was too soft, the audio engineers asked the Emperor for a second round. In the second recording, his voice was rather high-pitched and he had skipped some characters, but the technicians took it anyway. When the common people of Japan heard it for the first time, they were rather confused. Sure, they must have been really excited to hear their Emperor's voice for the first time, but the language of the rescript was very old, which common people didn't completely understand. Another thing was that the rescript does not literally mention that Japan had surrendered. It only says that Japan accepts the Potsdam Declaration, but many people had no idea what the declaration actually was. The atomic bombings are mentioned and the people are praised for their duties. Interestingly, the rescript says that the reason why Japan declared war on America and Britain was to ensure Japan's self-preservation and the stabilization of East Asia. One of the most interesting characters is the one that we don't get to see as much, only from a distance or behind his shoulder. I am talking, of course, about the Emperor Hirohito. This vague portrayal was very much intended. Makuo Matsumoto was actually the first actor to ever portray the Emperor Hirohito in cinema. The reason for why that happened so late as the 1960s, and as well so carefully, is because of the relationship between the Emperor and the common people of Japan. The Emperor of Japan is not just a person that gets to sit on a throne and represent the country. Many Japanese, especially in that time, believed that the Emperor is a god on earth. That is, because according to a first Japanese book called Kojiki, the Emperor is a direct descendant of the goddess or deity of sun Amaterasu, in a Japanese religion called Shinto. The Japanese emperorship is the longest ongoing monarchical house in the world, so that would mean that Hirohito is as well the descendant of the goddess, which makes him god as well. Remember that the biggest point, which also led to a postponing of the acceptance of the declaration, was that it did not specifically say that the emperor can continue his reign after the surrender. After the Meiji Restoration in 1868, the rule of the empire returned back to the emperor from a previous military shogunate. Even though the emperor had the power, most of the ruling was done by the Japanese government, consisting of the imperial diet, the cabinet, and the privy council. Emperor at the end of the war uses his power to actually end the war. When a new emperor is enthroned, he chooses a name for his era, which is also his posthumous name. Hirohito chose Showa, which could be translated as a luminous peace. I cannot really say it worked out that way. The portrayal of the emperor after this movie got more open, which led to a new adaptation about which I will talk later. When we watch the movie, we get to ask the question, who is the bad guy here? Is it the rebellious Major Hatanaka? Is it the Minister of War, General Anami, who learns about the coup but does nothing to prevent it? What we can hardly deny is that every character in the movie did what they thought was the best for Japan. That is something for me hard to believe, that everyone's intentions were so pure, but perhaps that's just my non-Japanese perspective from the 21st century. The movie does not make it difficult for us to figure out what's the message of the movie. We have a scene where General Anami, before his death, makes a speech which is more directed to the Japanese viewers than anyone else.
死ぬのは俺一人。死ぬよりは生き残る方がずっと勇気がいるのだぞ。俺ぐらいの年配になると腹を切るのはそれほど難しいことではない。難しいのはむしろ後に残るお前たち若い者の方だ。生き残った我々に一体何ができるんです？大臣は日本の国が再建できるとでも？再建しなければならんのだ。生き残る人々にはあらゆる苦しみが待ち受けておる。しかしこれからは日本の歴史が変わるのだ。どう変わるのか、どう変えなければならんのか、それは今の俺にはさっぱり見当もつかん。ただ、たとえ歴史がどう変わろうとも、日本人の一人一人がそれぞれの持ち場で生き抜き、耐え抜き、そして懸命に働く。それ以外に再建の道はない。いや、そればかりではなく、生き残った人々が二度とこのような惨めな日を迎えないような日本に、何としてでもそのような日本に再建してもらいたい。
And another one where Prime Minister Suzuki explains.
もう年寄りの出る幕じゃないよ。これからの日本はもっと若い人が中心になってやるべきでね。
And at the very end, the narrator says the following.
今私たちはこのようにおびただしい同胞の血と汗と涙であがなった平和を確かめ、そして日本と日本人の上に再びこのような日が訪れないことを願うのみである。ただそれだ。
All these scenes talk about the future of Japan after the war and the direction it should be taking. They say it's a duty for the next generation to rebuild the nation with peace and hard work, and to never repeat the same mistakes again. There is something I did not quite understand and couldn't find any answers. It is a book that was mentioned twice in the movie, The Priest and His Apprentice by Hyakuso Kurata. Kurata was an essayist and a playwright. His focus was philosophy and religion, which is also what the book is about. It is a stage play about the 13th century Buddhist monk Shinran. The book became his bestseller. Kurata was right-oriented and believed in concepts of fascism and theocracy, a form of government in which an authority is recognized as a deity or a god. This theocracy was the same belief of the monk Shinran from the book. That could be the reason why was the book presented, because it was seen in a possession of one of the students in Yokohama Guards who might have shared this opinion as well. The book could also just tell us that these were some educated students, though it is not very likely since just a few moments before we see a flag of a students' association. Or since we can see it the second time lying on the back of a truck at the Prime Minister Suzuki's private residence, it can be meant as a reminder and to recognize who are the soldiers attacking. But these are just my personal theories, and I could be wrong. If you have any idea or know what it meant, please let me know in the comments. Japan's Longest Day ended up as a box office hit of 1967. It was a smash commercial success, ending as the second highest grossing film of that year. The studio also interviewed the spectators after the movie to make a future strategies for other movies. They have found out that middle and older age groups were larger in numbers than usual. The ultimate perception of the movie also differed between younger and older generations. The younger age groups focused more on the horrors of the war, while the older generations focused on the courage of the people who saved the country. A 16-year-old spectator said the following: "Until now, I thought that the war had simply ended at some point. Therefore, I was surprised and inspired to think about the events once more. It made me realize that the young officer's patriotic attitude is absent among today's youth. This tells us that Toho's idea of an educational value was quite correct. It exceeded the studio's expectation and was an initial idea to make a series of big-budget war films released to commemorate the end of the Asia-Pacific conflict called 815 series. This series received a significant reaction in the Japanese print media, and the studio exploited it by presenting the 815 series as an exploration of the meaning of the war experience intended to benefit Japanese society. In 2015, a new adaptation of the incident was made by a director, Masato Harada. He focuses less on the rebellious Major Hatanaka and more on the emperor. Even though the name of the movie in Japanese is the same, to English it was translated as The Emperor in August. Harada explains his motivation in 2015 interview by Japan Times. Okamoto's film was not faithful to the book. He could not show the emperor's face on only in long shots or from behind, so he could not show serious discussions in the Imperial Council about important issues that involved both Emperor Hirohito and the Big Six. Big Six was a supreme war council including members like Prime Minister Suzuki and War Minister Anami. I wanted to go more deeply into the characters this time, staying faithful to the book. When asked if the movie could become inspiration to neo-nationalists, he explains, "This is an anti-war film. Its message is that only because we lost the army could we save the country. Some right-wing politicians or young people might look at Major Hatanaka and others and say they are cool, but this movie is a double-edged sword, meaning that none of its main characters are purely good or evil." I was fair to the Major Hatanaka character, even though I don't agree with him. I can't deny that some might take advantage of that approach, but people will take the film whichever way they want. During the second week of the release, the movie was number 8 at the Japanese box office. To give my personal opinion, though the 1967 movie is fast-paced and was sometimes hard to orientate with the characters and their role, even with the narrator's help and the names showing on the screen, it was still very enticing as from a perspective of a person who hadn't known virtually anything about the incident. And perhaps for the exception of some performances of the actors of Major Hatanaka and Captain Sasaki, which I saw annoying and ridiculous at the same time.
Hey.
今こそ我々は主として日本のために決然と立ち上がるべきです。重臣どもの仕上げ心から礼を述べたい。一戦をするに足らずです。自分たちは球場を占拠し天皇を擁護しております。その上下村総裁以下フォローも多数。はい、花中少佐。ぬれ。
Overall, the movie was quite enjoyable. If it wasn't, I would be probably making a video about it. In the description below, I will leave links to most of the sources I have used. I wasn't obviously able to mention everything about the movie and the incident, so I highly recommend checking it out. I hope you enjoyed this movie review and that you have learned something new. I will be more than happy to see your feedback and thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching and have a nice day.